Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody, for film buffs and lovers of the Ghostbusters franchise. The new movie's out, Frozen Empire. According to the BBC, it feels closer to a proper Ghostbusters film than any other sequel, which I guess is a compliment. Hollywood is optimistic, hoping for a $45 million opening weekend this weekend. Clearly, there's still money in the paranormal, or in imagining the paranormal that comes out of Hollywood, although perhaps we don't need to go to Hollywood to find the paranormal. Lots of headlines about most of us believing in the paranormal, whatever that means. The Pentagon now believes in UFOs, or have just published a new historical review of UFOs. People are now obsessed with a monolith mystery, which is re-emerging in Wales, talking about space aliens. UFO believers have even flocked to a quiet French town looking for an encounter of the third or fourth time. UFOs are everywhere. They're even, at least according to one ex-US Navy officer, underneath the sea, in the deepest underwater. One man who knows all about the paranormal is my guest today, Christopher French. He has a new book out, appropriately called The Science of Weird Shit: Why Our Minds Conjure the Paranormal. Chris has spent a life investigating the science of weird shit, and he's joining us, probably appropriate enough, from Greenwich in London. Chris, you going to go to the Ghostbusters, or is it a bit too close to home?
I might go. I mean, they're good fun, those films. I mean, whether you're a believer or a skeptic, you just take those in the spirit that they're offered, and they, pun unintended there. They are, they're funny films. They're good films.
So, Chris, you're the head of an interesting research institute, the Anomalistic Psychology Research Institute at Goldsmiths College in London. What exactly is the paranormal? What do we mean by that?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it's one of those things it's one of those words that everybody kind of thinks they know what it means, but when you actually try and put a precise definition on it, you realize things can get a little bit tricky. Now, it depends who you're talking to. If you are talking to a parapsychologist, parapsychologists are people who try to use the scientific method to investigate the possibility that there might really be paranormal forces in the universe. They have quite a strict definition in terms of they would restrict that term to matters relating to extrasensory perception, which comes in three varieties. You've got telepathy, alleged direct mind-to-mind contact. You've got precognition, the alleged ability to know about future events before they happen. And you've got clairvoyance, the alleged ability to pick up information from remote locations without using the known sensory channels. You've also got psychokinesis, or PK, the alleged ability to influence the outside world purely by thought alone. And the third area would be evidence relating to life after death. But beyond that, they would not call it paranormal. Whereas anomalistic psychologists and the media tend to have a much wider definition of really pretty much anything weird and wonderful. So they would.
Chris, that's what we got you on the show. You're the expert on the science of weird shit. What's your definition of paranormal?
I would go for the anything weird and wonderful stuff. But again, in terms of how you would, how do you kind of label something as being paranormal or not? In a strict sense, then I would say it's anything which cannot be explained in terms of currently accepted conventional scientific concepts.
Chris, we humans seem to always imagine the paranormal. It seems the whole history of monotheism or deitheism or multi-god universes, they're all attempts to make sense of existence and the universe in terms of the paranormal. Is that true? Would you include most religions in the context of humans trying to conjure the paranormal?
I think I personally would. I'm an atheist, surprise, surprise. And I mean, for me, certainly kind of any reports of miracles, well, that's something that's observable in the real world. You know, if people kind of say, well, I believe in God, I just have faith and that's why I believe, well, fine, that's kind of your choice. It doesn't really bother me that much. But if you claim that through your religion, you believe that people can be healed and so on and so forth, well, that's a testable hypothesis. We can look at that. But for me, that both paranormal beliefs in the more traditional sense and religious beliefs are examples of magical thinking. And magical thinking tends to kind of increase when people are in situations of kind of stress and uncertainty. And again, I think you can think of other examples of magical thinking. Beliefs in unfounded conspiracy theories would be another example.
Yeah, and we're going to get to those. I like this term, magical thinking. There's, of course, a tradition in literature of magical realism. For most of human history, we believed in magic. Magic has appeared to us normal, hasn't it?
And really, I mean, for me, part of skepticism is to always be open to the possibility that you might be wrong. New evidence might come along that proves that telepathy really does exist, but I don't think we've got that evidence yet, even though, you know, just we've been trying to study these things systematically for well over 100 years. But certainly, yeah, I mean, in terms of kind of, well, belief systems that are still very common around the world now, and certainly in the past, before people began to think in scientific terms, was part of their worldview, definitely.
So when we get to the title of your book, The Science of Weird Shit, are you attempting to make sense of the paranormal in terms of modern science rather than just a historical analysis of how we humans have operated?
Yeah, very much the former. Yeah. I mean, the working hypothesis of anomalistic psychology is to say, well, let's just assume as a working hypothesis that paranormal forces don't exist. Can we come up with plausible explanations for the weird experiences that people definitely do have? So that would include things like alien abduction claims, people thinking they've had a ghostly encounter, people thinking they've got psychic abilities, the whole range. Can we come up with plausible, testable, preferably, explanations? And then where we can try and put our explanations to the test, see if we can produce evidence that supports our non-paranormal counter explanations. So that would rely on things like looking at the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, the psychology of false memories, hallucinatory experiences, that whole kind of range of ways in which our minds can fool us.
And then you mentioned earlier, Chris, all these weird conspiracy theories in America in particular, although Britain, I think it also is included in this. People have odder and odder conspiracy theories. Is this also part of the science of weird shit? Are you suggesting that behind theories of Pizzagate and aliens abducting children and other bizarre things, there is some sort of scientific truth?
Well, I don't think there's any kind of scientific truth to those theories. I like to try and apply the scientific method to understanding where those kind of beliefs might have come and how they're maintained. And that's where I'm coming from. I'm a skeptic regarding all of those things. But I'm fascinated by what people can end up believing in. There's a philosopher friend of mine called Stephen Law who came up. He wrote a book a while back called Believing Bullshit. We don't all include that word in our titles, by the way, but he did as well. And he put forward the concept of intellectual black holes, as he calls them, which are kind of belief systems whereby once you're inside them, it's very difficult to get out. And I think the prime example there would be conspiracy theories, because if you believe the conspiracy, then any evidence that's the conspiracy, because you say that's been put there by the conspirators, and these are very powerful people, so They can manipulate all kinds of things. Any evidence, no matter how weak and shoddy, that appears to support the conspiracy, to accept that. That's a kind of very good example of an intellectual black hole. And kind of thinking about it in those terms, it helps to explain why people can end up believing, kind of the more extreme claims of, the QAnon movement and so on.
We've done lots of shows on QAnon and other types of movement. Some people argue, Chris, that we live in a time where more and more people believe in, to borrow your term, weird shit. Is that true, or has it always been the case and now we're a little bit more sensitive, or perhaps now it's been so politicized that everyone's aware of it?
I think it's more the latter, personally. I mean, these beliefs have always been around and they fluctuate somewhat. When Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, people started paying more attention to the sky, and there kind of seemed to be a bit of an increase in belief in UFOs and so on. So the media can influence stuff, but the beliefs have always been there. And when it comes to conspiracy beliefs, although again, particularly a lot of skeptics kind of bemoan the fact that they see increases in levels of belief in conspiracies. There's a good friend of mine, an American friend at the University of Miami, Professor Joe Usinski, and he's been monitoring levels of belief for many, many years, quite systematically. And he says, actually, no, the levels of belief have not increased dramatically over the years. I think what has happened is it's become much more part of the mainstream, thanks in large part to a certain American president who may unfortunately get elected again. So
I can't imagine who that is, Chris.
Try and guess. And so it's interesting. I mean, there's a kind of empirical questions as to whether or not levels of belief have increased. But I mean, they tend to fluctuate a little bit, but it's always been there, and I suspect it always will be. These beliefs will always be there. I don't particularly see it as my job to try to convince the believers that they're wrong. I'm kind of just interested in, well, on the one hand, are any of these claims possibly true? If they are, then that would be amazing in scientific terms. And if they're not, well, what's that telling us about the way the human mind works?
Yeah, and I don't suppose most of the believers will read this book, and if they do, they won't trust you. They'll claim you're part of some sort of scientific medical establishment. Is what some people at least think of as this assault on scientists, on scientific truth, on the scientific method. Is this part of it too? Does this concern you, or has that always been the case? Have scientists always been burnt symbolically, at least at the stake, by people who want to believe in weird shit?
Well, there have always been those people who are very kind of anti-science. They've always been around. I think maybe maybe things are a bit more dangerous in that respect these days. I mean, you look at the kind of particularly the dangerous conspiracy theories like the anti-vaccination movement and the threats that are made against people who actually stand up for science, and they are very kind of real threats. It's kind of very dangerous. And I don't know. It's hard to know what you can do. I mean, you can make some kind of very general kind of comments about we need to encourage more critical thinking. We need to educate kids earlier in terms of critical thinking, and that would all definitely help. And I'd strongly support that. These things, obviously, terms of you are going to try and persuade people, and I think on those kind of issues you should try and persuade people. I mean, it doesn't really matter whether your next door neighbor thinks the moon landings were faked. Who cares? It's fine, believe that. But that can kind of act as a gateway to more conspiracies, because if they lied to us about that, what else might they be lying to us about? And that's where you end up with people going down the rabbit hole and believing all kinds of really, really, really dangerous stuff. I mean, we see this, the psychology of false memories, and I mean that really totally plays into the kind of claims of ritualized satanic abuse and the notion that this kind of abuse is happening on a wide scale, and people end up being kind of hounded and harassed. All these beliefs, all these kind of weird conspiracy beliefs tend to correlate with each other. If you believe one, you're quite likely to believe others.
It's all about belief, trust, at least according to Chris French, the author of The Science of Weird Shit, a really intriguing new book out by MIT Press, one of the citadels of science, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Why our minds conjure the paranormal. In terms of trust, I certainly trust Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, who are bringing us these kinds of high quality, reliable, sometimes even scientific conversations. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Chris French to talk more about magical thinking, how to deal with it, how to celebrate it, and how perhaps to defend ourselves against it. So don't go away, anyone. We have our eyes on you.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are speaking with Chris French, the author of The Science of Weird Shit, Why Our Minds Conjure the Paranormal. Chris French has been studying the paranormal for many years in an illustrious scientific career. Chris, should we trust what we think we see and feel and hear? Is one of the weird things about our age that we don't always trust our own perceptions?
I think we should be worried about our own perceptions, actually. I mean, for most people, the strongest evidence you could possibly have is your senses, your experience. But as a psychologist, I'm aware of the fact that we often misperceive things, we misremember things, we misinterpret things. And
conveniently often, is there a degree of wish fulfillment here that we imagine,
absolutely,
hear and see and feel things that we want to hear, see and feel?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most pervasive cognitive biases that we all suffer from, believers and skeptics, is the confirmation bias. And what that refers to is the tendency that we have to pay more attention to evidence that supports what we already believe, and to feel a plausible reason to reject that seems to contradict either what we already believe or what we would like to be true. And that bias plays in at all kinds of levels. And as I say, it affects us all. And there are various biases that also seem relevant to explaining some of the stuff we're talking about, particularly paranormal beliefs and beliefs. We have what's referred to sometimes as reality, or Michael Shermer calls it agenticity. The notion that when it happens because someone or thing made it happen, has intentions to. That's it's not a big leap from that kind of a bias to a belief in spirits, in ghosts, in gods, and all kinds of other entities. Another bias that I don't know if you should call it a bias or a strength, but we're so successful as a species because we're really good at picking up on patterns and meaning and significance in what's going on around us, but we overplay it sometimes. And we think we see meaning and significance when it isn't really there. We join the dots and end up believing stuff and seeing stuff, and that really is based on kind of just random events, but we're kind of making connections. And obviously that's relevant to both paranormal beliefs and beliefs in unfounded conspiracies.
Chris, you note that we are so successful as a species because we've been better than other life forms at making the connections, making sense of meaning. But are you also suggesting that if we believe in too much weird shit, we might be less successful as a species?
It could happen. It could happen. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, in terms of our survival as a species, then despite the fact that, we've had lots and lots of claims in the past that we're living in the end times, the things, the world's coming to an end to all intents and purposes. We can really safely say that with climate change, we genuinely are living in those kind of times now. And again, that is another kind of interesting situation where the world's best climate scientists are all in full agreement that unless we take really action very, very urgently, we will go past a point of no return. And that will have dire consequences for all life on Earth. But the conspiracy theorists don't believe that. They say, no, that's not happening at all. The threats are coming from the deep state and all kinds of other imaginary sources. But I mean, again, in that context, we can see that people are stressed. We've had, I think, more turmoil in the last few years than I can remember in my lifetime ever. We've had President Trump, we've had Brexit, we've had the coronavirus. And like I said before, when we go through these kind of phases of uncertainty, both at the personal level and at the societal level, that's when magical thinking and engaging
Brexit and Trump. I mean, Trump is a sort of reality television president. We've had those before in the US, or certainly TV presidents. Talk about Brexit, doesn't seem that dramatic. Britain chose to leave the EU. They only joined it 50 years ago.
Disaster consequences.
Well, it has, but everything has consequences, Chris. You don't need me to tell you that. I wonder whether the normal times, so we've returned to what we might think of as normal times, where stuff happens, where change happens, where you get politicians you don't much care for, where traditional institutions are challenged. In a way, the weird times was the period between the 1980s and the 2010s, where nothing changed, where everything seemed to be normal.
Maybe. I mean, I think that, it's the kind of, there's also, I think, with particularly technological advances, there's the speed of change, which is accelerating. And again, I think that leads to uncertain outcomes. I'm kind of no expert and certainly wouldn't care to forecast what that direction, but there is a kind of sense that people are very concerned that things are getting out of our control, and that we don't know where these things are leading. And again, I think that all feeds into people generally feeling kind of more anxious, and that is all part of the kind of cocktail of uncertainty and stress that I think
it might drive us towards another kind of cocktail. I mentioned earlier that Ghostbusters is out this weekend. A lot of people are going to go and see it. I wonder whether in traditional 20th century industrial society, we were able better to separate the science of weird shit from the science of real life. So we went to the movies to see the paranormal, and then in our lives we led, I don't know what the opposite of the paranormal is. We led normal lives rather than paranormal lives. And it never occurred to us that reality was in some ways paranormal. Have we mixed up in our digital age, perhaps a post-Hollywood age? I mean, there still are Hollywood blockbusters like Ghostbusters, but they tend to be less dominant culturally or economically these days. Have we mixed up fiction and fact? And does that mean that many people can't actually separate the science of weird shit from the science of normal life?
I'm not sure that that's necessarily any kind of more of a factor these days than it always has been. I mean, there've always been people who are fantasists. One of the kind of personality dimensions that correlates with paranormal belief and reports of paranormal experience is fantasy proneness. That's something that's been studied in its own right, not just with respect to paranormal beliefs within psychology. And it is that some people do seem to have greater difficulty in terms of separating fact from fiction. Again, there's a lot of research on this. It's called reality. say in the area of memory, how do we decide that that is a memory for something that genuinely did happen out in the real world, or is it just a false memory or a memory for something we imagined? And there's a lot of research on this, who are more susceptible to mixing, being unable to separate the two. From my point of view as a psychologist interested in paranormal beliefs, that is of interest. There's a whole range of other kind of personality dimensions there. But I don't necessarily think that there are more people around who are particularly fantasy prone these days than there once were.
Final question, Chris. 21st century has promised to be the century of artificial intelligence. Huge amount of investment and economic and technological progress on that front, particularly out here on the West Coast of the United States. How do you expect the emergence of smart machines to impact on the science of weird shit? Could it clean it up? Could we rely on AI, which will clarify what's weird and what isn't? Or might it be a piece of a new world where everything's weird and everything is equally credible?
It's a great question, and I do not know the answer to it. So
we better ask OpenAI. Yeah, maybe OpenAI will be able to help us.
Ask ChatGPT. It's really interesting that some of the kind of, I wouldn't claim to be an expert in the latest developments on AI, but the notion that AI itself could have hallucinatory experience and separates fact from fiction is, I think, a real one. I think it's almost an inevitable consequence of having kind of, we're highly developed as far as we know. We're the most intelligent species on the planet. Some might argue with that. If we've got this, AI that is really vastly more intelligent, would that side of things be pushed? That only time will tell. Or maybe if you can find a decent psychic who can foretell the future. I wouldn't care to hazard a guess on that front, I'm afraid.